London in the late autumn of 1872 possessed a peculiar talent for cruelty disguised as civility. Beneath polished chandeliers and velvet laughter, reputations could be shattered as delicately as crystal, and no spectacle delighted the aristocracy more than a graceful downfall. On that grey morning, the ancient cathedral of St. Bartholomew shimmered with candlelight and expectation, for the wedding of Lord Frederick Ashbourne promised to be the grandest social event of the season, and perhaps its most scandalous. Carriages lined the narrow street outside like obedient black swans, their polished doors opening to release ladies wrapped in satin cloaks and gentlemen smelling faintly of cologne and ambition. Inside the cathedral, whispers drifted beneath the towering arches as guests arranged themselves in pews with the strategic precision of chess players. Fans fluttered, monocles gleamed, and every voice lowered itself into the conspiratorial hush that accompanied the prospect of delicious humiliation. For Lord Frederick Ashbourne was not merely marrying, he was performing. Tall, handsome, and blessed with the careless confidence of a man long accustomed to admiration, Frederick moved among his guests with a smile polished as silver. His dark coat fit him perfectly, his posture radiated effortless charm, and his laughter rang bright beneath the vaulted ceiling. Yet those who watched him closely might have noticed a sharper glint behind his pleasant expression, as though the entire ceremony were a stage upon which he intended to deliver one final act of triumph. That triumph had a name: Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Only a year earlier she had been Frederick's fiancée, admired throughout London for her quiet grace and thoughtful intelligence. Society had once predicted their marriage with eager certainty. She had possessed beauty, certainly, though it was not the fragile prettiness fashionable among débutantes. Instead, her appeal lay in composure, in the steady calm of her gaze and the gentle dignity with which she carried herself through rooms full of scrutiny. But admiration in London could curdle into suspicion with terrifying speed. Rumors had appeared first as murmurs at garden parties. Then came whispers at opera balconies, half-heard conversations behind gloved hands. No accusation had ever been spoken plainly, yet the implication spread with the speed of flame through dry leaves. Eleanor Whitmore was not as virtuous as she seemed. Frederick had ended their engagement within a fortnight. The decision, announced with elegant regret, had preserved his reputation while leaving Eleanor's in ruins. Invitations ceased. Doors closed. The city that once celebrated her grace now pretended it had never known her at all. Most assumed she had vanished into quiet obscurity. Yet this morning, as guests gathered beneath the cathedral's golden light, Frederick's closest companions understood the truth behind the final invitation placed discreetly upon Eleanor Whitmore's doorstep. He had invited her to watch him marry another woman. Not merely watch, but witness her own defeat. Near the altar, Frederick accepted congratulations with charming modesty while a small circle of friends laughed softly around him. One gentleman leaned closer, lowering his voice in delighted disbelief. "You cannot seriously expect she will attend." Frederick's smile widened. "My dear Charles," he replied smoothly, "curiosity is the most powerful force in London. A woman abandoned so publicly cannot resist the chance to see the conclusion." "And if she does appear?" another asked. Frederick's gaze flickered briefly toward the cathedral doors. "Then society will observe precisely what becomes of those who mistake ambition for virtue." The remark drew a ripple of laughter. Beyond their circle, the bride's family glowed with pride, unaware that the morning's true entertainment had little to do with the ceremony itself. All across the cathedral, whispers drifted like perfume through the air. Would she come? Could she possibly dare? Minutes passed with agonizing elegance. The organist tested a solemn chord. A page boy fidgeted near the aisle. Rain began to fall softly against the cathedral windows, blurring the pale daylight beyond the stained glass. Frederick felt the first quiet bloom of satisfaction. Perhaps she lacked the courage after all. The bride arrived soon afterward in a cascade of ivory silk, escorted by her father beneath a flutter of admiration. Guests rose gracefully to their feet as the music swelled. Frederick turned toward the aisle with theatrical tenderness, extending his hand toward the life of comfort and wealth awaiting him. The ceremony began. The priest spoke solemn words about devotion, loyalty, and the sacred bonds of marriage. Yet even as vows hovered in the air like delicate glass ornaments, a restless tension threaded through the crowd. Eyes drifted repeatedly toward the cathedral entrance. Still no Eleanor. Frederick's composure settled into serene confidence. Perhaps humiliation required an audience that would never arrive. Then the great doors opened. The sound echoed through the cathedral with startling clarity, as though the building itself had drawn a breath. Every head turned at once. Rainy daylight poured through the entrance, silhouetting two figures against the pale gray sky beyond. A woman stepped forward. At first, many failed to recognize her. The Eleanor Whitmore they remembered had been gentle and soft-spoken, a young lady who lowered her gaze beneath society's attention. The woman entering the cathedral now moved with a quiet assurance that stilled every whisper in the room. Her gown was midnight silk, its dark elegance absorbing the candlelight like deep water. No extravagant jewels adorned her throat, yet the simplicity of her attire lent her an almost regal presence. She walked slowly down the aisle, her posture straight, her chin lifted with calm dignity that seemed utterly untouched by the cruelty once directed toward her. Frederick felt the faintest crack in his triumph. But the true astonishment came from the man walking beside her. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly composed, he wore a black coat whose severe lines mirrored the reputation that preceded him. His presence carried a gravity that silenced even the boldest gossip. Several guests inhaled sharply. For few men in England commanded such wary respect. Sebastian Ravenscroft, the Iron Duke. And as Eleanor Whitmore reached the center of the cathedral beside him, calm as winter moonlight beneath 100 astonished gazes, society realized with a collective shiver that the woman invited to witness her humiliation had arrived escorted by the most formidable man in the kingdom. A hush fell across the cathedral with such sudden weight that even the organist's lingering chord faded into uneasy silence. Society, so fond of whispering cruelty, now seemed briefly uncertain of its own voice. Every gaze fixed upon the woman who had once been dismissed as ruined, yet who now walked with a composure that unsettled the careful balance of the morning's spectacle. Eleanor Whitmore moved slowly beside the Iron Duke, her steps measured, her shoulders straight beneath the soft sheen of midnight silk. The candlelight caught along the folds of her gown, illuminating a figure transformed not by extravagance but by dignity. Those who had once pitied her now struggled to reconcile memory with the quiet authority she carried through the aisle. The Duke did not hurry her. His presence was not merely escort but shield, a silent declaration that the woman beside him was not to be handled lightly. Sebastian Ravenscroft had long been known as a man of iron habits and colder reputation. His estates were vast, his wealth formidable, yet it was his temperament that fascinated London most. Few claimed friendship with him, fewer still dared offend him. Now he walked beside Eleanor as though her place there required no explanation. Frederick Ashbourne felt the room shift in ways he had not anticipated. What he had expected to be a moment of public victory now carried the faint tremor of uncertainty. His smile remained polished, but the corners of it tightened as Eleanor and the Duke approached the front of the cathedral. Guests parted instinctively, as though the air itself had grown heavier around them. "Remarkable," murmured a lady in emerald silk behind her fan. "She has returned." "Returned?" another whispered. "She has arrived transformed." At the altar, Frederick forced his attention back to the ceremony, though his thoughts drifted like restless birds. Eleanor's calm presence pricked at his composure in ways he could not immediately explain. She should have appeared nervous, diminished, uncertain. Instead she stood quietly beside the Duke, her gaze level, her expression serene. The priest cleared his throat and continued the ceremony, though the words of devotion seemed curiously fragile against the rising current of curiosity in the room. Vows were spoken, blessings offered, and polite applause eventually rippled through the congregation as the couple was pronounced husband and wife. Yet the true drama lingered not at the altar, but several steps away. As the crowd began to stir, the Duke guided Eleanor toward a side aisle where sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering crimson and sapphire patterns across the marble floor. For a moment they stood alone within the shifting colors. Frederick watched them. He could not help it. The sight of Eleanor's hand resting lightly upon the Duke's arm stirred an irritation that surprised him with its persistence. He had ended their engagement with admirable decisiveness. He had chosen a richer bride and secured his future. There should have been nothing left to trouble him. And yet, he crossed the distance between them with the smooth confidence that had served him all his life. "My dear Miss Whitmore," he said lightly, though the title carried deliberate emphasis, "what an unexpected pleasure." Eleanor turned toward him without haste. "Lord Ashbourne." Her voice was calm, neither warm nor cold, and the absence of resentment unsettled him more than anger might have. "I had wondered," Frederick continued, "whether my invitation might have been inconvenient." "I find the morning quite illuminating," she replied softly. The Duke remained silent beside her, his gaze fixed upon Frederick with an unreadable stillness that made the air feel several degrees colder. Frederick laughed lightly, glancing toward the curious faces gathering nearby. "And your companion?" he asked with feigned politeness. Surely London's most elusive gentleman does not attend weddings without reason. Before Eleanor could answer, Sebastian Ravenscroft spoke. His voice was deep, measured, and entirely devoid of apology. I attend where I please. The simplicity of the statement carried such quiet authority that Frederick felt the faintest flicker of irritation ignite within him. Of course, Frederick replied smoothly. Still, society is curious by nature. When a lady once believed disgraced appears in such distinguished company, speculation becomes inevitable. Eleanor regarded him steadily. Society has always enjoyed speculation, she said. It is rarely concerned with truth. Frederick smiled as though indulging a child. Truth is often a matter of perspective. Sebastian's gaze did not waver. Not always. Their exchange drew a small circle of listeners, each pretending casual interest while absorbing every word. Frederick sensed opportunity in the attention. My dear Eleanor, he said with theatrical gentleness, if my invitation caused discomfort, you need only have declined. There was no obligation to attend. She tilted her head slightly. And yet you sent the invitation. The quiet remark landed with delicate precision. Frederick's smile tightened. Curiosity, perhaps. Or satisfaction, Eleanor suggested. A faint ripple of laughter stirred among the onlookers. Frederick felt heat climb subtly beneath his collar. Well, he said briskly, the morning has concluded happily regardless. I trust you will find London forgiving. The Duke moved then. Not dramatically, not even with visible impatience, but with a small, deliberate gesture that drew Eleanor half a step closer to his side. The movement altered the entire conversation. Lord Ashbourne, Sebastian said calmly, you appear under the impression that Lady Whitmore requires forgiveness. Frederick blinked. Lady Whitmore? A murmur swept through the watching guests. Eleanor did not correct the title. Instead she lifted her gloved hand, and the candlelight caught upon a slender band of diamonds circling her wrist, a bracelet unmistakably belonging to the Ravenscroft family collection, recognized by several startled aristocrats nearby. The Duke's voice carried across the marble floor with quiet certainty. My wife requires nothing from you. For a moment the world seemed to pause. Frederick stared at Eleanor as the meaning of the words settled like frost across his triumph. His discarded fiancée had not returned merely composed. She had returned transformed. And the Iron Duke of Ravenscroft had just declared her his Duchess. The murmurs began at once, spreading through the cathedral like a rising tide beneath polished shoes and rustling silk. What had begun as a wedding had quietly transformed into a spectacle of scandal. Guests who moments earlier had applauded the bride now leaned toward one another with bright, hungry curiosity, for nothing delighted London society more than the sudden reversal of fortune. Eleanor felt every whisper brush against her shoulders like cold air. Yet she did not shrink from them. Standing beside Sebastian Ravenscroft, she held her posture with the same quiet composure that had carried her down the aisle. If anything, the revelation had steadied her, as though the truth had placed a firm floor beneath the trembling expectations of the room. Frederick Ashbourne, however, looked as though someone had struck him across the face. My wife, he repeated slowly, his voice thinner than he intended. Surely that is a jest. Sebastian regarded him without the faintest hint of humor. I do not make jokes about marriage. The simplicity of the reply deepened the silence surrounding them. Frederick's gaze flicked toward Eleanor, searching for some sign of embarrassment or apology. Instead he found calm. She met his eyes without hostility, yet without the lingering softness he remembered from their former engagement. It was as though the fragile girl he once dismissed had vanished, replaced by a woman who understood precisely where she stood. You married him, Frederick said at last, disbelief creeping into every syllable. Yes. Her voice carried no triumph. The quiet certainty of it unsettled him far more than gloating would have. Around them the whispers intensified. The Iron Duke has taken her as his Duchess. When did this happen? Impossible, he has avoided society for years. Sebastian ignored the speculation. His attention remained fixed upon Eleanor with a subtle attentiveness that did not escape the observant few watching nearby. Though his expression remained controlled, there was an unmistakable protectiveness in the way he positioned himself between her and Frederick's scrutiny. Frederick noticed. And what inspired such devotion? He asked sharply. Charity, perhaps? Eleanor felt the insult pass through the air like a dull blade. Months earlier, the remark might have wounded her deeply. Now it merely confirmed what she had long suspected about Frederick's character. Before she could answer, Sebastian spoke. My reasons are not your concern. Frederick laughed, though the sound carried a brittle edge. On the contrary, your grace, they have become quite the concern of London. Sebastian's gaze hardened slightly. London concerns itself with many matters that do not deserve its attention. The exchange drew several guests closer. What had begun as gossip was swiftly becoming confrontation, and no one wished to miss a single word. Eleanor sensed the gathering tension and lightly touched Sebastian's sleeve. That will be quite enough, she said softly. He turned toward her at once, the cold authority in his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Frederick observed the small shift and felt a sudden stab of irritation he could not explain. You see, Frederick said with forced amusement, even now she must guide you through the delicate etiquette of our society. Sebastian's reply came without hesitation. I have never required society's permission to do anything. Frederick opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor spoke first. This morning was meant to celebrate your marriage, Lord Ashbourne, she said. It would be unfortunate if it became remembered for something less gracious. Her tone carried no accusation, yet the words struck with quiet precision. Frederick flushed. I merely wish to ensure that old acquaintances were properly welcomed. And we are, Sebastian replied calmly. For a moment Frederick struggled to reclaim the composure that had seemed so effortless earlier that morning. His carefully planned humiliation had dissolved into something he could no longer control, and the audience he intended to impress now watched him with open curiosity. You must forgive my confusion, he said stiffly. The last I heard, Miss Whitmore had disappeared entirely. Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly toward the cathedral windows, where rain traced pale silver lines down the glass. Yes, she said quietly. I did disappear. The admission stilled the nearby whispers. Disgrace can be remarkably persuasive, she continued. One discovers very quickly how fragile society's kindness truly is. Frederick shifted uncomfortably. That was never my intention. The lie hung in the air, transparent as mist. Sebastian's voice lowered slightly. Intentions are best judged by actions. Frederick looked between them, sensing the quiet solidarity forming where he once expected humiliation. And you simply appeared at the right moment to rescue her? He asked the Duke. Sebastian's gaze remained steady. I arrived when she required honesty. The words stirred something in Eleanor's chest, something fragile and warm that she had tried carefully not to examine too closely. Frederick scoffed. How noble. Perhaps, Sebastian replied. Or perhaps I merely recognized a woman whose courage deserved better than the cowardice she encountered. Several guests shifted awkwardly at the remark. Frederick felt the insult settle upon him with unmistakable weight. You imply a great deal, Your Grace. I state only what I have observed. The tension between them tightened like drawn wire. Eleanor sensed that if the exchange continued, the morning would descend into open hostility. She turned gently toward Sebastian. Shall we go? She asked. He studied her face for a moment, as though searching for any lingering discomfort. Finding none, he inclined his head. Of course. Together they moved toward the cathedral doors, leaving Frederick standing amid the murmuring crowd. The guests parted again as they passed, their whispers no longer tinged with pity but with fascination. Outside, the rain had softened into a delicate mist that cooled the stone steps and muted the city beyond. Eleanor paused beneath the shelter of the archway, drawing a slow breath of damp autumn air. Sebastian remained beside her, silent but watchful. You handled that rather well, he said after a moment. She allowed herself the faintest smile. I have had practice surviving London. The remark carried both humor and truth. He studied her quietly. You were not obligated to endure any of this today. Perhaps not, she said. But some ghosts prefer to be faced in daylight. A carriage waited at the curb, its dark lacquer gleaming faintly beneath the gray sky. As they descended the steps together, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of relief and uncertainty. 4 months she had lived under Sebastian's protection, sheltered by the unexpected marriage that restored her dignity. Yet standing beside him now, she realized something she had not yet dared to ask. When they reached the carriage door, she turned to him. Your Grace, she said softly, there is something I must understand. He met her gaze. Yes. Her voice lowered slightly. Did you marry me only to defy him, or because you wished to? For a moment, the misty air between them seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor had not intended to ask the question so directly, yet once spoken it could not be reclaimed. The words lingered between them like a fragile thread, trembling with the possibility of truth. Sebastian Ravenscroft stood beside the carriage, the gray morning settling across the broad lines of his shoulders, his expression unreadable as ever. He did not answer immediately. The delay unsettled her more than anger might have. Eleanor lowered her gaze briefly, feeling the familiar instinct to retreat from vulnerability. In the weeks since their marriage, she had grown accustomed to Sebastian's steady protection, his quiet authority shielding her from the sharp edges of London society. Yet protection, she knew, was not the same as affection. "I apologize," she said gently. "It was not my place to question your motives." Sebastian's voice came quietly. "It is precisely your place." She looked up again. The Duke's gaze rested on her with an intensity that carried none of the cold distance the world associated with his name. Instead, there was something far more complicated in his expression, something thoughtful, almost guarded. "You believe I married you to provoke Lord Ashbourne," he said. "I believe," Eleanor replied carefully, "that you are a man capable of decisive action when confronted with injustice. And that injustice required marriage?" "Perhaps not," she admitted. Sebastian regarded the wet cobblestones for a moment, as though measuring a memory against the present. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quieter tone. "Do you remember the winter ball at Whitmore House 3 years ago?" The question caught her by surprise. "Yes," she said slowly. "My father hosted it shortly before our engagement was announced." "You wore a silver gown," Sebastian continued. "There were white camellias woven into your hair." Eleanor blinked softly, astonished by the detail. "You attended that evening?" "I rarely attend anything," he said. "But I was there." She searched her memory, yet the night returned only as a blur of music and candlelight. Frederick had been attentive, her father proud, the house bright with laughter. She could not recall seeing Sebastian Ravenscroft among the guests. "I do not remember speaking with you," she said. "You did not." He lifted his gaze back to her. "I observed." A faint warmth stirred unexpectedly in Eleanor's chest. "That seems a curious pastime for a duke." Sebastian's mouth curved slightly, though the smile was brief. "I had recently returned from the northern estates. London felt loud. I preferred watching to participating." "And you watched me?" "Yes." The simple honesty of the admission unsettled her more than she wished to admit. "Why?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because you were the only person in the room who appeared entirely sincere." Eleanor felt the faintest color rise in her cheeks. "That is an unusual compliment." "It is an accurate one." For a moment the distant noise of carriage wheels drifted through the fog, reminding them that the world beyond the cathedral continued moving without regard for private revelations. "You admired me from across a ballroom," she said softly. "Yet you allowed me to become engaged to another man." Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. "You seemed happy." "I was hopeful," she corrected gently. "And hope deserves its chance." She studied him with growing curiosity. "When the rumors began," she asked, "did you believe them?" "No." The certainty in his voice carried the weight of iron. "Why not?" "Because lies have a particular scent," he replied. "And the accusations surrounding you smelled of cowardice." Eleanor looked away briefly, remembering the endless whispers that had once followed her through drawing rooms and gardens. Even now the memory carried a sting. "I wondered if anyone doubted them," she admitted. "I doubted them." "And yet you said nothing." Sebastian exhaled slowly. "At the time you were engaged, my interference would have appeared inappropriate." She gave a faint, rueful smile. "Inappropriate concern might have been welcome." His gaze softened slightly. "Yes, I realized that too late." The confession settled quietly between them. Eleanor felt the strange, shifting sensation of understanding something new about the man beside her, something deeper than the distant protector she had married out of necessity. "So when the engagement ended," she said, "you decided to intervene." Sebastian shook his head. "When the engagement ended, I expected Ashbourne to correct the situation." "He did," she said dryly. "By abandoning me." "Yes. And that was when you appeared." "Eventually." Eleanor frowned slightly. "You sound as though you hesitated." Sebastian regarded her steadily. "I did." "Why?" "Because I knew what marriage to me would mean." She tilted her head. "I am discovering that presently." "The position of Duchess of Ravenscroft carries little warmth," he said quietly. "My household is orderly, my reputation severe. I have few friends and fewer social obligations. It is not a life many women would choose willingly." Eleanor considered this. "And yet you offered it to me." "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated only briefly before answering. "Because watching your ruin from a distance proved intolerable." The word struck her with unexpected force. She felt the fragile beginnings of emotion stir within her chest, something cautious yet luminous. "You barely knew me," she said. "I knew enough." "And that was worth marriage?" "Yes." The firmness of the reply left little room for doubt. Before Eleanor could respond, the cathedral doors opened again behind them. Guests began emerging onto the steps, their voices animated with renewed speculation. Among them appeared Frederick Ashbourne, his expression darkened by wounded pride and curiosity. His gaze fell immediately upon the pair standing beside the carriage. Frederick descended the steps slowly, his new bride lingering several paces behind him, confusion evident in her posture. The murmuring guests instinctively drifted closer once more, sensing that the morning's drama had not yet reached its final act. Frederick stopped before them. "So," he said coolly, "I see the conversation continues." Sebastian's expression hardened again, the brief warmth of their private exchange vanishing behind the familiar mask of authority. "Good morning, Lord Ashbourne." Frederick glanced between them, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "I wonder," he said lightly, "whether London will ever learn the true reason behind this sudden marriage." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "London may learn whatever story it prefers." Frederick smiled thinly. "Then allow me to offer one." Sebastian stepped forward slightly, his presence immediately altering the balance of the confrontation. "I would advise caution." Frederick ignored him. "The story is quite simple," he continued loudly enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "A disgraced woman required a husband, and an isolated duke required a distraction." A ripple of shocked laughter moved through the onlookers. Eleanor felt the old sting of humiliation threaten to rise again. But before she could speak, Sebastian's voice cut through the murmuring air with quiet, dangerous clarity. "You mistake generosity for weakness, Lord Ashbourne." Frederick's smile faltered. Sebastian continued, his tone steady but unmistakably severe. "You also misunderstand the nature of my patience." The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving the air cool and sharp. Around them, the watching guests sensed the shift in atmosphere and fell silent once more. Frederick lifted his chin defiantly. "And what exactly does that mean?" Sebastian's gaze did not waver. "It means," he said calmly, "that if you continue speaking about my wife with such disrespect, I will feel compelled to reveal precisely why she refused to marry you in the first place." The words landed like a spark dropped into dry tinder. Frederick's confident expression cracked with sudden alarm. And Eleanor realized, with a quiet surge of astonishment, that Sebastian Ravenscroft knew the one truth Frederick had spent the last year desperately trying to hide. The carriage rocked gently along the slick cobblestones of London, rain-slicked and glimmering beneath lantern light, carrying Eleanor Whitmore and Sebastian Ravenscroft into a world that had shifted beneath them in mere hours. The city's chatter had faded into a distant hum, leaving only the soft thrum of the horses' hooves, the occasional splatter of rain against the windows, and the quiet tension shared in the enclosed space between them. Eleanor drew a hand to the window, tracing the pale streaks of light across the glass, and for the first time allowed herself to breathe without the weight of public scrutiny pressing against her shoulders. Sebastian remained rigid beside her, though his usual icy composure bore a subtle looseness, a restraint that suggested the inner storm he did not yet permit himself to name. She watched him, the sharp angles of his profile softened by the lantern glow, and felt a stir of curiosity that bordered on trepidation. She had spent months living with his protection, accepting his authority, yet the question that had hovered quietly in the cathedral now demanded answer. "Sebastian," she began, her voice low enough to blend with the soft cadence of the carriage, "I need to know. Did you marry me merely to restore my reputation, or because you wished to?" He did not reply immediately. His gaze lingered on the dim city streets passing outside, reflecting upon the wet pavement as though seeking words that might suffice. When he finally spoke, it was with measured deliberation. "I married you because it was necessary," he admitted, his voice carrying neither triumph nor apology, but a clarity that struck Eleanor with the weight of truth. "Necessary to preserve your dignity, yes, but also because I could not endure watching you suffer any longer." Her breath caught, an involuntary response to the depth of feeling in his words. It was one thing to know she had been protected, another to comprehend the extent of his vigilance, the lengths to which he had gone, not for society, not for spectacle, but for her alone. "You have been kind," she said, her tone soft, carrying the fragile weight of unspoken gratitude. "And yet I still wonder if it was only obligation that guided your actions." Sebastian's hand moved slightly, brushing against hers in a gesture so fleeting that it could have been dismissed as chance. Eleanor's pulse quickened, sensing the electricity beneath the simplicity. "I would be dishonest if I said it was obligation alone," he confessed, his eyes finally meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to reach past the veil of society's expectations. "I have admired you long before the scandal began, long before Ashbourne thought he could dictate your fate." Eleanor's mind raced. The memory of her engagement to Frederick Ashbourne, the humiliations, the whispers, the cold dismissal, all of it surged with fresh clarity, contrasted now with the unwavering support she felt in Sebastian's presence. Her voice trembled slightly as she dared to speak the question that had lingered in the shadow of their union. "You loved me?" Sebastian's expression softened imperceptibly, and for a moment the Iron Duke was nothing more than the man who had quietly watched her, who had chosen her when others had abandoned her. "Yes," he said simply. "I loved you long before you realized it was possible, long before the city turned against you, long before you needed a protector. And when the world sought to undo you, I acted, not out of necessity alone, but because I could not bear the thought of losing you to their cruelty." The carriage seemed to still around them. Eleanor felt tears prickle at the edges of her vision, a mixture of relief, astonishment, and the tentative bloom of affection. She had long feared that her marriage was merely a shield, a convenient arrangement for a woman of ruined reputation. Instead, it had become a bond forged from truth, admiration, and a deep, unyielding regard. "Sebastian," she whispered, reaching out to take his hand fully, feeling the warmth of his grip. I never imagined." "You need not imagine any more," he interrupted gently. "You are not to endure, nor are you to doubt. You are my wife, my Duchess, and the woman I have chosen to honor above all else." The carriage slowed as they approached their estate, its windows glowing warmly against the rainy night. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile, the first of genuine ease she had permitted in months. The storm of society, the calculated humiliation, the relentless whispers, none of it seemed to matter now. She was safe, she was respected, and above all, she was seen. Yet even as the carriage wheels ground to a halt, the tension of the day clung stubbornly to the edges of her thoughts. She could not ignore the memory of Frederick Ashbourne, the man who had sought to humiliate her for his own amusement, whose pride now teetered on the precipice of public exposure. She glanced at Sebastian, who read her expression with that uncanny awareness that had first unsettled her months ago. "Will he cause trouble?" she asked quietly. Sebastian's lips curved with the faintest trace of a smile. "Let him try," he said. "He has underestimated you once. He will not do so again." The carriage door opened, and they stepped onto the stone steps leading to the estate. The air smelled of wet earth and autumn leaves, the familiar scent grounding her after the chaos of the morning. Inside, the hearth glowed warmly, casting long shadows across polished floors and walls lined with ancestral portraits. The quiet was almost unbelievable after the storm of social judgment that had accompanied her arrival at the cathedral. Sebastian offered her his arm, and she took it without hesitation. As they moved through the hall, she felt a sense of intimacy settle between them, a shared recognition that the day's trials had not weakened her spirit but had refined it, sharpened it like the edge of a polished blade. "You have grown stronger than even I imagined," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "And you," she replied, a hint of teasing in her tone, "are less intimidating than rumor suggests, at least when you are speaking to me alone." He chuckled softly, the sound deep and rare, and for the first time Eleanor allowed herself to relax completely. The man beside her, the Iron Duke, was formidable, yes, but also capable of warmth, affection, and unwavering loyalty. She realized with quiet astonishment that the love she felt blooming within her chest was not born of gratitude alone. It was mutual, subtle, and as strong as any force London society could marshal against them. They reached the library, a quiet sanctuary lined with leather-bound volumes and the faint aroma of aged parchment. Sebastian motioned for her to sit beside the fire, and she complied, feeling the last traces of morning's tension dissolve. He seated himself opposite her, the room between them filled with soft light and a profound sense of unspoken understanding. Eleanor spoke first, her voice carrying a note of tentative wonder. "I feared this marriage would be a convenience," she said, "a shield against society's cruelty. Yet it has become something entirely unexpected." Sebastian's gaze softened, the icy lines of his expression melting just enough. "Love is often found where we least anticipate it," he said. "And sometimes, it takes calamity to reveal what is most true." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the distant patter of rain and the occasional creak of the house settling around them. Eleanor realized with a quiet thrill that she no longer feared the judgment of London, nor the memory of humiliation. She was seen, cherished, and loved. The Iron Duke was not merely a protector, but a partner, a man who had chosen her with deliberation, care, and passion restrained by dignity. Finally, she allowed herself to lean slightly toward him, feeling the warmth of his presence like sunlight after a storm. "And you," she said softly, "truly love me, do you?" Sebastian's hand reached for hers again, his fingers interlacing with hers with deliberate certainty. "Entirely," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "If this marriage began as protection, it has grown into something far more profound. You are not only my Duchess, Eleanor. You are my heart, my companion, my chosen life." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of joy, and for the first time she allowed herself the full measure of emotion she had restrained for so long. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the quiet triumph of their union. The city outside remained a blur of rain and rumor, yet within the library the world had narrowed to the two of them alone. Sebastian's lips brushed hers lightly in a promise, a tender acknowledgement of what had grown from necessity into love. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, feeling a calm she had never known in the months of exile and scrutiny. And in that quiet, luminous moment, she realized the profound truth. The woman invited to witness her own humiliation had walked away not in shame, but in love. The Iron Duke's devotion had transformed a day designed for despair into the dawn of a life unshakable, eternal, and wholly their own. Beyond the window, London continued its restless motion, but inside, the storm had passed. Eleanor's heart, once fragile and exposed, now beat steady beneath the shield of love, honor, and unwavering truth. The carriage of life had delivered her through rain, rumor, and betrayal, and at last she had reached the moment she had not dared to imagine. She was safe, she was cherished, and she was loved. And as the night deepened, with the city lights shimmering faintly through misted panes, Eleanor knew that no power, no whisper, and no malice could ever again unsettle the bond forged this day, between the Iron Duke and the woman who had returned to claim not only her dignity, but her heart.